Over to you, Namita. Let's
All
start.
right. Thank you very much, Ranu Chacha, for this. Thank you very much to the family members who've all come here, on a Sunday afternoon. And it's very mesmeric for me to see all your faces before me. And I also want to say that, Brijveer Chachaji, who started the G10 forum, whenever I argued with him about the non-representation of women on that forum, he always acknowledged that, yeah, actually, I don't know how it happened, but we should have had some women on it. So I'm very happy that Ranu Chacha took this initiative further, along with Vishu Chacha and Madhu and Rahul and who's the fifth person? Chand. They took this ahead and, they acknowledged that the family is indeed a very talented family and there's a spectrum of issues which we can address. So I also dedicate this to Brijveer Chacha, with whom I could have a debate or an argument or a discussion on any theme close to my heart. And, he was always ready to engage in this session. All right. So 34 years it's been, and we now have the new national policy of education. So the first question which should come to our minds is, why did we have to wait for 34 years? The last policy was in 1986. It was called the New Education Policy. And the first policy, the official policy of independent India, was in 1966. It was called the First Education Commission, also called the Kothari Commission. Means to upward mobility. Two kinds of mobility. One is social mobility, because if I get educated, I can aspire higher. I can actually get a better job. I can leverage a better life for myself and also for my family. And there are many success stories which have shown this in the post-liberalization world. That is one thing. So one is occupational mobility. The other is social mobility. When I have occupational mobility, I become upwardly mobile socially as well. And then I don't carry the label of my caste with me any longer. And if I wish, I can stop using my caste certification. And because there have been many success stories in the private sector of the lower castes and the marginalized castes who have made it big, we actually saw this happen.
Our people from a diversified country, we come from rural cultures, we are part of urbanized sectors, and education is important in every household. At the end of the day, every parent has probably said this to their child, that beta tumhe kuch banna hai. So how do you get that across? How does the child make himself competent enough? And I think primary level has to, under all circumstances, focus on medium of education being the baat-cheet. What do you need?
Striking features are the graded autonomy, the multidisciplinary, the multilingual, and a word that you sort of didn't emphasize is sustainable education, which I take it to be very, very important as departing from the past policies probably. And in practical application, this has really been neglected very badly. Having worked in vocational education college, I know that this has not been given the priority that it deserves. So taking these as the highlights of the education policy, again, I'll repeat, graded autonomy, multidiscipline, sustainable education, multilingual. These are the key elements of the new economic policy that strike me. And in the light of that, that centralization that we are seeing in the umbrella of the Higher Education Commission with its 4 pillars, which control almost all aspects of education, all aspects, whether that is justified or is going to achieve its goal or becoming over-controlling. The words that made me really, sit up are, it is written, it is light and tight control. Light and tight. These words are so vague. Light and yet tight. What do they mean? I don't understand. So the point is, what sort of control are we envisaging from these vertical pillars under that umbrella, which is the Higher Education Commission? Now, We know that one aspect is funding, the other is accreditation, the third is the courses and the curriculum and all those aspects of education. Now, since there are so many changes which have been thought of in the higher education field, I wonder, taking the present situation as it is, the spread of institutions.
Autonomy. Now, we already have autonomy, but it is a limited autonomy. The university still gives out the degrees, and the degrees of Mumbai University. But in many ways, we can start new classes, we can start new subjects. The teachers, we can recruit teachers as we want. So there is a certain degree of autonomy in the college. But full autonomy is something which has to be looked at very, very seriously, because the college is on its own. Of course, what happens is you depend on the private sector, on people who will give you money, for making. Of course, the government also gives you. It's not as if the government will not fund you. The government will fund a college which has a full autonomy, but there are lots of minus factors also and then what happens? That graded autonomy means that the colleges which already have grades, good grades, they are the ones who rise even more, while the colleges who have lesser grades will anyway not make it to autonomy.
On to the best schools and the best colleges, not only in India, but abroad. My concern is about the rural areas. And I personally feel that the major impact of any change in the education policy must have an impact in the rural areas, because that is where the largest number of children are. Schools and their infrastructure, it's in a terrible condition. Ranu was talking about unemployability of graduates in Gujarat. Any number of surveys have been carried out which show that even 5th standard students in rural schools can't do simple addition and subtraction. So the need of the hour really is to have very good infrastructure in the rural areas, to have very good teachers. And one thing which, Namita, I don't think I was looking for it in the new education policy, but I couldn't find any reference to it. We have to train the parents also. Parents in the rural areas have to play a very, very important role. No amount of policing by bureaucrats or by lower level education officers can keep the schools under check. But the parents can. What is the infrastructure of the school like? Is the teacher coming? Is he teaching regularly? And in addition to all this, we have to rely on new technology, on teaching through computers, through television. The best teachers in the states can be identified to prepare capsules which are transmitted, and the teachers need to be trained only in translating these lessons for the students. This is something which is already being done in Karnataka and some other states. But I think ultimately in the next 10, 15 years, if we can bring about a change in our rural education system, primary and secondary, it will make a major difference to the development of the country. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So Shantanu Bhaiya, I couldn't agree with you more, but what I couldn't mention because of paucity of time was that they are setting up special educational zones. Earlier, they used to have educationally backward blocks identified where kinds of inputs were being given at ashram schools and residential school girls, etc. So they're up.
You're not audible.
Namita,
plan zones. Yeah.
you're not audible. You'll have to come closer to your laptop and speak.
Okay. And you can hear now? Can
No.
you hear me, Suvira?
No.
Can all of you hear me, please? You can't hear me. So I've
now
lost
we
the
can. Now we can, Namita Didi. Now you're better.
You can,
Just stay
you
where
can.
you are.
So yeah, so I'll stay where I am. So you know what is happening is that there are special educational which are going to be set up, which used to be earlier called the educationally backward blocks. And those special educational zones are going to work with local contextual conditions and plan the educational interventions. And the school management committee of every school is going to have parent representation, not for tokenism, but for actual democratic participation. This is what is being envisaged. Whether it will work or not, we don't know. Yeah.
Over to you, Vaishali.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Savira Bhabi. And a very thorough and brilliant presentation. As expected, Namita Didi, thank you. And thank you, Ranu Mama, for organizing this session. It's really very good. I had a few questions. One is around inclusivity, Namita Didi. Has the special ed for the differently abled been adequately considered in this NEP? This is an area where we see in other parts of the world, there are a lot of opportunities for, children who are differently able, but in India, we've not seen it. We are focusing on things like SC, ST, and so on and so forth, which has been on the agenda for decades. I think it's time in these current times to look at some of the other, segments which require attention. My second question and point is around, we are living in a global village. So, with respect to entry of global universities, etc., don't you think as long as there is regulation of quality and profiteering, we can increase the quality of supply of private and global educational institutions? Is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? Because that will increase competition and hence quality. Because, part of what you presented reminded me of the debate we would have in the 90s that should we let MNCs enter and what impact will it have on our sort of inbuilt companies, etc. So, I guess your perspective on that would be good because, we really look up to the IITs. But when you look at the infra which these institutions have compared to their counterparts in the rest of the world, it's not great. We have amazing students, but the infra is nothing for us to be proud of. And last point, I know we're running out of time, but just one last point, that we talk so much about STEM. I'm a great advocate of STEM myself. But do you think we're doing some disservice to children who may not feel they're adequately, good in these areas? And so therefore, we are crushing their confidence with respect to how they experience education. Because, we speak with so much of reverence with STEM-related subjects. But when we look at the other sort of arts and the other sort of social sciences, there's a little bit of foo-fooing around it. So, that's important. Do you think it's important as an educationist? Should we be kind of more fair towards the different streams of education we have?
Okay.
That's all. Thank you.
So very interesting questions and I'll give very quick responses. So Vaishali, we have a Persons with Disability Act which has been passed and 21 disabilities are part of that act. And all schools and all colleges are to, by a Supreme Court order and by Act of Parliament, admit such persons. So schools have become inclusive spaces, so have colleges. But within the persons with disability, we have a 4% quota for them. Within persons with disability, it's the visually challenged and the orthopedically challenged who dominate the disability sector. So they have their own set of problems. So that is one thing which I wanted to flag. And so we are not only focusing on the socially marginalized, we're also looking at the disabled. The second question which you've raised is that the discourse of the 90s used to somewhere resist, the entry of the private sector and the multinational sector, etc. But you're saying if we have good private institutions, we already have some good private universities. But, the debate is that if education, welfare and education is a public good, which they declare it is. So should you be then privatizing it to such an extent that the private sector sets up a power hegemony. It's a debatable point. I'm not going to, I think I'll have a private discussion with you on this, because this is also determined partly by our ideological positions and our leanings. But the state has declared that education is a public good and education is for welfare. So when you look at that kind of a focus, you have to take your cues from that issue. The STEM approach, because it's contemporary and new and it's just been introduced in our schools, it is there, but it's not the only approach to science teaching and learning and education. It's not that the liberal arts are not being taught. It's not that the performing and fine arts are not being taught. All of them are being taught. So it's a more holistic perspective, but STEM has its own contributions. And until we try it and test it and take it on, we won't know what the repercussions, consequences, and results are. I think Ranu Chacha is saying, let's call it a day now.
Ranu Chacha, I'll just take just 1 minute because there's an interesting comment from Ruhi. And it's difficult for everybody to read chat. It says, Ranu Mama, just to add to what everybody has said in response to your question, I wanted to add that 1, management schools have started getting professors of practice, in brackets, industry experts as faculty. This has helped improve the practical aspect of learning in a management classroom. 2, several companies run year-round programs at management schools to create traction with the students as future employees. This helps increase their interface with industry, which improves their employability as well. I think the more we can do things like this, the better will be the student training and employability. So thank you, and I hand you back to Ranu Chacha.
Hi family, this was hugely enjoyable. I hope all of you were as engaged as I was, and I thank you, Namita, so much for an excellent session today. And all the other speakers that you invited were very knowledgeable. Rashmi, Kirti, Veena, Gigi, they were all spectacular. I just want to make a very short announcement that next session will be on living with COVID. This will be led by GV and a couple of others who we are yet to identify. I have begun to identify them, and this will be held on the 6th of September. And then 2 weeks later on the Sunday, whatever Sunday that is, I think is the 20th of September, we are having the Kudwar story.
Wow.
Right? And this will be led by Dakshita. I haven't spoken to her. I hope she doesn't refuse me. But this will be led by Dakshita. All right. So basically, this is the announcement. I really enjoyed myself, and I hope all of you did. And please pass your comments on the family chat, so that those who are not here understand that they missed something special. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you for being here and
Thank you.
make very nice, lively, and enriching our perspective building process. Thank you very much.
Ranu and Namita.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Arey wah, Arjun.
But I'll leave you with a thought. Ranu, may I?
Yeah, he's
Ranu, go ahead.
Chacha, go ahead.
Is education all about ability and livelihood and not about living and life and making good citizens out of
क्या कह रहे हो? सुनाई नहीं दे रहा है.
Is education only about employability and livelihood and not about life and in making good human beings and good citizens?
Yes.
It does. It does talk about good citizens and good human beings. It does.
We show the new education policy does talk about, talks a lot about value education. A lot about value education.
I hope they also walk the talk.
No, they do.
She's not read anything.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Ranu, wonderful.
Bye. Bye-bye.
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 the first question that was sent as a survey was, I feel that this pandemic is going to end. And there is a whopping number of people in our group, around 40 responses. And if you look at the responses, almost 40 to 50% think that this pandemic is going to end by either mid 2021 or the end of 2021. Now, as a person who has been involved with the COVID scheme, I would like to put my 2 bits of thought over here that this mid 2021 or end of 2021, both are very, very optimistic. Is going to be the end of it. The pandemic as a disease will probably be here with us for another 2-3 years. What we need to know is whether we can
relevant points, and I'm going to put them just down as points rather than a narrative, come from the work that we are doing on COVID, which is a big Government of India initiative where we are following a large cohort of COVID positive patients. We have almost now 3,000 COVID positive patients who we are following from the time they get admitted to the hospital or are tested positive over a period of almost a year. And we'll follow them up. We will follow them for a year, and trying to understand what's happening to the disease, looking at their biological samples, looking at their clinical data, largely to create a biorepository which can help in developing diagnostics and vaccines. Still don't know whether you're going to have asymptomatic infection, symptomatic infection, or you'll end up in the ICU. Unfortunately, that evidence is still not available. The other thing is, when should you get this test done? And Givi said that people have said they'd like to quarantine themselves for 14 days. I think one of the biggest problems that we've had is that people have shied away from testing. Testing is absolutely critical. You have to test, because not only are you getting to know what you have, you're also protecting people around you. If you don't know that, you're not going to be able to protect the people around you. Contact should be tested a week after the index case has tested positive. So if there's an index case, then a week after the last contact with that index case should be when you should test. Otherwise, you can be falsely negative. You may not be harboring the virus, it still may not be there, and the test may not be able to pick up that very low titer in your. The other problem that we've had, and I don't want to dwell too much onto, is this antigen testing that is happening all over India. I don't know, globally also they're doing it. Antigen testing for personalized testing is not good because it's missing 50% of cases.
The sort of the UK experience, and also about my experience with COVID, and I worked on ITU, so some time ago now. So I was deployed in April and May, and I think India is coming a little bit later in COVID than we have here. So we've kind of gone through it, and I think you guys are sort of slowly following the same thing. But hopefully, things are getting a lot better. In my hospital, we only have 3 ITU COVID patients now, and I think less than 20 people in the hospital, and we had the most in the UK at one point. So it's quite a dramatic change. And some of my experiences, and I was very fortunate, so working in ITU, I saw sort of patients who had the privilege of having round-the-clock care, 1-to-1 nursing, or 2-to-1 nursing sometimes, which is not normal for ITU. Usually you have 1 nurse to one patient, but because of shortage of staff, we had 2-to-1, which is still amazing compared to wards, which I'd imagine in many other places it's maybe 1 or 2 nurses to 20 patients.
Please do not believe that herd immunity is round the corner. Do not believe that if you get the infection, you're going to be saved and you're going to develop the antibodies, you have the protection, and it's not going to happen that way. There's still a long way to go. We need to have at least 70% of our population to have the antibodies or the immune protection which can protect those who do not have, who can protect those who get infected. So if you have 10 people with the infection or who've had the infection and are protected, that one person in that would be saved. So that is the kind of herd immunity required for being able to protect us.
And personal point of view is that of the first responders. So I will quickly touch upon how it happened initially, what was the response that we had to make, and in future, what can we expect in the next 6 to 8 months to maybe a year. So quickly, the most important thing as first responders that faced the police, whether it was NYPD here in New York, because US was one, Europe and US were one of the first state, and after China. And New York emerged as one of the earliest epicenters after Italy in terms of COVID deaths as well as infections. So the response of NYPD, like all other forces, in the first response was that besides the criminal situation that they faced, they suddenly had a plethora of spike in calls of people who were panicked. At the same time, they did not know, nobody could help them. So the most interesting part was that they asked all support, psychological, sociological, COVID, in the first month, say March, beginning to March end, which were not related to COVID, but anything that came in became a COVID situation.
Well, you know, if you look at the COVID data, you see that 80, and I've looked really at the mortality data on the assumption that it's difficult to compare across countries because the levels of testings are very different. So if you look at what is the level of incidence in different countries relative to each other, it becomes very difficult. Whereas the mortality data, flawed as it is if you take this as a single measure, perhaps it's the easiest to compare. So what is, initially most of the pandemic began, of course, in China. And then from there it spread to Europe. So at that point in time, in the early stages, it seemed that, it's basically, the thing is spreading to a region of around 30 degrees north, and the countries below that, the incidence was very. And now if you look at the COVID deaths, 54% are in the Americas, North and South America. Now they have about 12-13% of the global population, and they're 54% of COVID deaths. And if you include, the eastern border of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, you have about 80% of the deaths accounted for by 25% of the population.
Is a mask which is actually meant for a healthcare worker. For a general population, for everybody else, a normal cloth mask would suffice. Now, there are two things which a mask does. If you are infected, it does not allow your infection to go to anybody else. And if somebody else is infected, to some extent, it prevents your droplet from going out. That is the purpose of a mask.
Others, tragically, because we are largely a migratory.
Really learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to speak about what my father wrote in his diary. And that's all. I'm not going to speak about him, but I'm going to speak about Kudwar and what his memories were. I just have to tell you that he left Kudwar when he was 11 years old. And he went to study in Faizabad. And of course, then he used to come back for holidays, like a lot of his siblings who were married or working, used to come back and back to Kudwar for holidays and vacations. But I'm going to speak let's start with Kodwar. What was Kodwar? Kodwar was a village of 300 people, approximately 300 people, but it was an estate. It was a royal estate. It was ruled by a Raja. And it had, as Dakshita said, lots of agriculture fields around with green peas and chana and sugarcane, and it had the river Gomti running nearby. It was actually a very small place.
Hear of Kodwar all the time. Day in and day out, it's oozing out of our ears, it's oozing out of our systems. She relives every moment, every memory in Kodwar. So from her accounts, life in Kodwar was nothing short of a royal existence, with Rani Sahiba, her entourage, her palace with a grand carpeted staircase, liveried attendants, sprawling gardens, tennis court, badminton court also, according to her. And she says there was a swimming pool too. And she says family members, especially the seniors, swam in the pool. And their own home, she says, was nothing short of royalty. In the absence of electricity, the traditional pankha kept them cool, you know, the ancient pankha made of fabric. It worked with a pulley system operated by a person deputed to just pull the fan. Every room, she says, had a fan. She remembers the dining table as a huge dining table with just Babuji sitting at the end of the table, Bibi by her side, feeding him. And this was one time when no child dared enter the room,
which he shared with us. And here is an interesting episode. I'll just read it out from the paper itself. Sitting in the courtyard with the family for lunch, my mother had asked special khilwa urad dal to be prepared, our favorite. When it was getting late and the dal's flavor overwhelming us, my mother shouted, "Thakur, why are you delaying serving us? Hurry up." Thakur was our general cook. He replied in his typical village language, "Mataji, मैं क्या करूं? उड़द की दाल में मिर्च फटफट कर रही है, करत है। और घी पक है."
Or ghee?
He meant that the full red chilies which had been put in were quarreling with each other, falling on their sides. They were not listening. 15 minutes later, he made the chilies settle down, and we had a hearty meal, laughing all the way at the hilarious description of the fight.
Then let me give one example which only I am privy to as far as Kodwar is concerned. I was born in a little kothari, and the doctor who delivered me was a dai. There was a man standing outside the kothari. The moment it was known that a son was born, he had to put up his 12-bore double-barrel gun and fire 2 shots in the air. Wow. So I may be the only person for whom gunfire was fired at birth. Wow. Now you press on with your rest of your stories while I...
ज़्यादा बुराई मत करना. And I think I can take liberties with Dakshita because, you know, we're related from the Mathur side of things.
Yes, no doubt.
Plus, I don't know whether you know that we were in school together. Of course, I happen to be her house captain in Loreto Convent, Lucknow.
Yes, of course.
And we have a lot of people from Loreto. So her questions to me were that I should talk about how, as a new entrant, how I felt. Now, new sounds really strange considering we've been married 38 years. But yes, in 1981, which is when I first encountered the family, and Ranu Chacha, the first people I met were Chachi ji and Brijbir Chacha. The first impression I got then, or even a little later, was one word, and I do not mean it in a derogatory way, and that word was formidable.
I think I was an accident. I was born very, very late, probably unexpectedly, but I have also learned a lot of new things from this meeting. I will not take more than maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes. My only intention to speak is not exactly to sum up, because nothing gets summed up in Purwar. I mean, so many years, so many decades. I think every decade and every year has its own story. I will add some new things later. For the time being, I would like to ask Amar, if he is still there with us, with the entire family, that Nalini Bhabhi did a tremendous job, and she has compiled this booklet which requires to be updated. So I'm taking this booklet in this forum because I want all of us, including Gen 5, as Ranu Bhaiya said, and Gen 5 also has to do a lot of additions because 20 years have already passed and this requires updation. So I request the seniors like Ranu Bhaiya, of course we are all there to help you, Bhaiya, and Nalini Bhabhi has done her job. So it's the progeny now, the senior progeny now, which takes care of this particular family booklet, who's who.
Speak. Yeah. So my Kurwar's quick story brings in another perspective, and it's based on literally on strange coincidences. So my mother, whose name was Kamla Verma, at the young age of about 15 or 16, actually went to Kurwar. She had gone there for the wedding of her brother, Madan Mama, to Urmila Das, the sister of Brijbir Saran Das. And she told us the story that while she was there in Kurwar, the family, you know, I don't know whether she went for the wedding or she went post-wedding or whatever it was. And Madan Mama, incidentally, her brother, Gopal Bhaiya and Vinita Jiji are the children. So while she was there, she said that, you know, the whole family and all the brothers and sisters, everybody got together and they were enacting a play called Krishna. And Mr. Brijbir Saran Das was given the role of Sudama. And now in the play, there was this highly emotional, dramatic homecoming scene of Sudama, who'd been away for many years, was returning home, and his wife, Sushila, you know, was waiting at the door of the kutir, and she saw him coming from a distance, and she ran sobbing towards him and touched his feet. So my father-in-law, sorry, he was not my father, Mr. Brijbir Saran Das, then went to the director of the play. I think it was Kamla Bobo. My mother used to call them Kamla Bobo and Sheila Bobo and all that. And said, ki, bhai, mujhe to Sushila ka role aapko, nobody's taken their names, but the two sisters were, I think, Baijanti and Lavanga. Yeah, yes, I don't know which one he wanted the role to be given to. But he said, ki, ye role Sushila, Sudama's wife, to inhi ko jayega.
Pleasure it is. And everything what I had written was 100% correct. It was not only oral, it was real. I have come across everything myself seen. I adore every relative of mine, at this age of mine, at this age of mine. I am just to all good life, all of you, and I'm sure that after me, some one of you will take over charge as the senior most and will carry on the family traditions. I hope Ranu and Premveer will follow it to the extent. Thank you very much, all of you. I am grateful to you.
Thank you.
Mummy was in the hospital and Papa had a dream, and BBG came in his dream and told him that I am going to come here as, to this earth as your daughter, and you call her Kirti.
Okay, I see.
Please name her Kirti.
Wow.
And apparently after 10 minutes, he gets a call from the hospital in the night, which says that daughter born, and please proceed